I studied Shakespeare a lot as a student. I loved Shakespeare, took tons of Shakespeare courses, wrote a lot about the plays, didn't pay any attention to the authorship or the biography as a student. I sort of had heard that there was an authorship question, as you do, you hear that some people say it was Christopher Marlowe or the Earl of Oxford or whatever, but I honestly didn't care, who cares? That's sort of the attitude a lot of people take towards it. And then later I came back, I was really fascinated by Shakespeare's women as a young college student, as a feminist. Shakespeare's feminist heroines were really interesting to me, and the way he deals with gender and sexuality generally in the plays is so modern. It feels so relevant to the conversations we still have about gender today. And so I had this question in my head: how did Shakespeare come to write these women? The Cambridge scholar Juliet Dusenberry says Shakespeare's drama deserves the name feminist because in his plays the struggle is for women to be human in a world that declares them only female. How did this male 16th century playwright come to write feminist drama? Another scholar, Anne Barton, says Shakespeare has an uncanny understanding of women that's sort of missing in the work of his fellow playwrights. So where did this uncanny understanding come from? And so I started looking at the biography, and I remembered that there was this question around the authorship. I was fascinated by the fact that some of our, the pillars of the literary world, Henry James, Mark Twain, Walt Whitman, Nabokov, Hemingway, Joyce, have all been fascinated by the authorship question. And many of them have been quite convinced that the name was a pseudonym for a concealed author. Henry James wrote, "I'm sort of haunted by the conviction that the Divine William is the biggest and most successful fraud ever practiced on a patient world." Whitman was convinced there was another mind behind the plays. Twain wrote an absolutely hilarious essay that I wish more people read today, just completely making fun of the Shakespeare scholars and biographers for their essentially religious, idolatry of Shakespeare and their absolute refusal to countenance any questions, and they're angry. They get so angry. He really makes fun of how angry they get about it. So I wanted to know why they doubted. It's one thing, a lot of people like to say, oh, it's a conspiracy theory, but a lot of really smart people have questioned this. Supreme Court justices, historians, philosophers, Nobel-winning physicists, smart people are interested in this subject. So you have to understand that there's something to it, and I wanted to understand what that was. And so I just started digging into. You look first at the biography of Shakespeare, the biographies that have been written. A famous one, for example, is Stephen Greenblatt's Will in the World: How Shakespeare Became Shakespeare. There are tons of these. Since the 1998 film Shakespeare in Love, there have been, I think, 25 biographies of Shakespeare. They just churn them out. And the reason they churn them out is because they have no idea how he came to write these works. And the vacuum is actually incredibly productive for scholars because they can just keep writing more biographies and keep creating their own sort of fictional imagining of how Shakespeare came to write these works. One critic in the London Review of Books called Stephen Greenblatt's biography biographical fiction. And that's what all these are, essentially. They in order to fill in the void, the gaps, they have to speculate. And so they imagine, well, maybe he did this, maybe he did that. He could have, should have, must have. There's nothing there. When you start tearing it apart, you realize there's not much substance there. So, and then after the biographies, you start seeing all the reasons for questioning the authorship and the evidence there is for either other authors or for believing that it was someone, using this name. So, okay, you asked about the Atlantic article. I was initially intrigued by the fact that there were female candidates. Most people don't talk about the female candidates. So there have been 2 women proposed over the years. Mary Sidney was first proposed in 1931. And as part of a kind of a group authorship theory, the man who proposed her, an English economist named Gilbert Slater, suggested that she contributed to the plays as part of a group of writers working on them, and that she might help account for their feminine intuition, as he put it. And then more recently, Amelia Bassano was put forward because of some of the plays' connections to Bassano del Grappa, which is where her family was from in Italy. So I initially wrote the Atlantic article to just look at the idea of female authorship. You know, the Shakespeare scholar Phyllis Rackett has said that she's convinced that women were involved in the plays produced in the Renaissance theaters, but that their authorship may be impossible, you know, to prove, because there were so many reasons in that period for concealing the fact that a woman had a hand in writing a play. But women, you know, women of the upper classes were highly educated, and they were interested in drama and literature and writing. And I think it's actually pretty hard to believe that they weren't involved. I think that's a little naive to think that they weren't involved in the production of drama in that period, especially under the rule of a very strong female monarch, you know, who was herself a great devotee of the theater. So that initial article, you know, I wrote it to look at Mary Sidney and Amelia Bassano. It was sort of edited to look more at, to focus more on Amelia Bassano. And, you know, it was fairly explosive, went viral very quickly. People loved it or hated it. I was castigated as, you know, a Shakespeare denier for questioning the authorship. You know, pejorative term, it's important to note, they're sort of using the language of climate change denier or Holocaust denier, but, you know, suggesting that there's something like deeply immoral here about questioning the authorship. And I found that to be quite amusing and intriguing. I mean, I should say it was shocking at first when all these attacks started coming in. I had never experienced that as a writer. It was, you know, as a young journalist still building your reputation, it's a little bit terrifying, honestly, to be attacked that way, but on the internet. You know, there's a real fear for your career, for your reputation. When the initial shock subsided, I realized these attacks have given me something very interesting, because why are they comparing a question about the authorship of 400-year-old plays to a moral conundrums like authorship, like Holocaust denial or climate change denial? Those are ethical issues. And so they're trying to, in making those comparisons, they're trying to elevate what is purely a literary historical question into somehow an ethical problem. And that was interesting to me. Why is it immoral to question Shakespeare? And some scholars have said it is. Inquiry is the very basis of the historical discipline. So all of this was a sort of red flag to me that there is something quite fascinating to dig into here. And, you know, I'm a little bit of a contrarian, to be honest. And the more people were sort of telling me, you know, essentially don't go there, naturally, the more I wanted to go there, the more I wanted to investigate this. The authorship, those gaps. Okay, well, to start with the women, one is the fact that his own daughters appear to have been functionally illiterate. According to paleographers, one signed her name with an X, which is what you did back then if you couldn't, you know, sign your name, and one signed with a signature described as painfully formed and probably the most she could do with the pen. So the women in Shakespeare's plays are extraordinarily intelligent. They write letters, they compose sonnets, they read Ovid, they're very witty, they're very sharp, they pretend to be lawyers, you know, they're constantly outwitting the men in the plays. It's a huge discrepancy there. That's just one example, but it's the sense in which the glass slipper does not fit somehow. The plays, what we know of these plays, don't fit what we know of this person who, you know, let his own children go illiterate. You know, what kind of writer, let alone the greatest writer in the English language, doesn't care to educate their own children? So very bizarre right there. Doesn't make any sense. When you start to dig into the biography, the problems you realize are, you know, one is that there's no, he has no recorded education. You know, there's an assumption that he attended the local grammar school. Maybe he did, but the grammar school was pretty limited. It was, you know, those were provincial one-room schoolhouses that taught Latin grammar and arithmetic. The plays, on the other hand, are absolutely brimming with sort of the cutting knowledge of Renaissance humanism, philosophy, knowledge of classics, astronomy, theology, history, court politics, European, like what's going on in Europe, French, Italian. The author in the plays draw on lots of source texts. Many of them hadn't been translated into English. So this author can read French and Italian and Greek and is you know, using sources from those languages and often using French and Italian in the plays. Someone who seems to have traveled in Europe, particularly in Italy. So again, this discrepancy between sort of the knowledge profile of the man and the knowledge in the plays. And that's where scholars, they have no idea how to bridge that gap. There was a hilarious conference here in DC at the Folger Shakespeare Library a few years ago called Shakespeare and the Problem of Biography. And all these scholars convened to sort of wring their hands about how difficult it was to reconstruct Shakespeare's biography. And in the opening remarks, one of them said, the biggest lacuna of all is the mystery of how he ever became a writer in the first place. They don't know. And the real contradiction for me in this whole thing was, if they don't know and they admit that they don't know, how can they profess such certainty on this subject? They don't have the grounds for certainty that they like to claim they have. And the hilarious thing about that conference, of course, Shakespeare and the Problem of Biography, is that they didn't, even though they were big discussion about the problem of biography, they didn't stop to consider that the problem could be that they have the wrong biography, right? That's not up for discussion. So, there are a lot of other little issues. You look at Shakespeare's will. Meticulously bequeaths all of his assets. He was quite wealthy when he died, landowner, businessman. When he dies in 1616, there is no mention of books, plays, poems, manuscripts, a literary life of any kind, nothing. Doesn't seem concerned about the preservation of his life's work, is not bequeathing. And, he had to have owned hundreds of books in order to write those plays, and was deeply interested in, in music, in other lands, must have had maps, must have, nothing bespeaking an intellectual life, so it's these things that are very odd. There was no mention when he died that the great writer Shakespeare had passed. This was an age of eulogies, in which when other poets died, Edmund Spenser or Christopher Marlowe, Francis Beaumont, it's discussed. There was a kind of hugely gossipy world of literary London at the time. So you can find letters where people say, our poet Edmund Spenser died last Saturday and was buried at Westminster, or mourning the murder of Christopher Marlowe in 1593. Ben Jonson, when he dies, there's a huge funeral at Westminster, and anyone who's anyone in London is at the funeral, and he's buried, first of all, burial in Westminster is sort of recognition of, your contribution to the nation as a poet, to be buried there. So when Shakespeare dies, there's just silence. This is bizarre. The works are famous. They're widely read and commented upon in his lifetime. So the fact that there's total silence at his death, it's just strange. There's no good explanation for it. He was a businessman. He was a shareholder in the theater company. He seems to have been an actor, at least early on, but mostly a businessman involved in the theater. So you can certainly tie him to the theater world. There's no evidence of a writing life in his records. So other writers leave letters in which they refer to their writing, or there's payment records paying them for writing, or there's eulogies at their death discussing their writing. All manuscripts sometimes, diaries or journals, there's obviously lots of things have been lost over the centuries. But for other writers, you can find those pieces of evidence. Sometimes it's even just, evidence of education at Oxford or Cambridge, whatever. You can find those bits of evidence that allow you to trace, however faintly, the course of their literary career. What you can't find for Shakespeare is that kind of evidence testifying to a life dedicated to writing. There are lots of references in the period to the works of Shakespeare and to this person writing under the name Shakespeare. But it's like praising, Mark Twain's works. It doesn't tell you really anything personal about who that person was, who's using that name. So, I don't think everyone has their, skeptics have their own theories for why the name might have been used, why someone might have wanted to conceal their authorship. It's hard for us to, of course, put ourselves in the mind of a writer and explain psychologically why they did that. I don't think you can pretend to do that. You can suggest various reasons. It was a great age of sort of pseudonyms and anonymity. There's a whole book called the Anonymous Renaissance about sort of the culture of using pseudonyms. And there are various reasons. One, of course, is just sort of freedom of speech. This was not a free society. So if you wanted to be critical of the government or of the church, and you wanted to avoid punishment, like getting your hand chopped off or getting your nose slit or being thrown in jail, you might use a pseudonym. Women obviously had good reason for concealing their authorship. It was considered essentially immodest for women to publish under their own name. There's a wonderful little poem from the period in which a writer refers to a woman who is powdering a sonnet as she does her hair and then prostitutes them both to public air. And it's this idea that to market yourself, to put your words out in the public sphere as a woman is as a kind of prostitution. It's immodest, and so it was not something women were really meant to do. Some women sort of got around that taboo by writing mostly religious verse. That was, if you're writing for God or in sort of a holy vein, that's somehow more acceptable. But it was not proper for women to be writing and well, not to be publishing. When the Folger Shakespeare Library was opened in DC, Shakespeare was praised as an honorary American immortal alongside Lincoln and Washington. So Shakespeare is so important to Western culture generally, and I needed to understand how he became a kind of god, because that's what happens. He becomes a god over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, to the point where it becomes truly heresy to question Shakespeare. And that's how people are treated. You're a heretic if you doubt the author. So the book goes through that history, and in the process of examining that history, it also looks at how doubts began to develop and the different theories that cropped up over the years. It's very stressful to dwell in a state of uncertainty about things. So people want to be certain, they want to believe it was this person or that person, and it's really hard to simply admit, actually, we might not know, and let's instead just keep exploring. And that's really the note I tried to end on. And I think readers will all sort of have their own theories about who it was, but I didn't want to make the book isn't actually about arguing that it was a woman or it was Oxford or Marlowe. And other heresies. Let's look at these different theories. I mean, if it comes down on any side, it comes down on the side of skepticism and uncertainty and having a little bit of humility, actually, because a lot of this is about human arrogance and hubris and our desire to assert that we know things.